G'day, Cobber. It is election season in Australia with the 2019 federal election due to be held on the 18th of May. The campaign has already started and we're going to see lots of politicians wearing akubras and visiting construction sites and wearing hard hats, trying to look relatable. And for political nerds like me, this is the most exciting time of the year. So Australia has a bicameral parliament. That is, it has two houses. It has the 150 member House of Representatives, also known as the lower house. So I'm here to give my breakdown of the 2019 Australian federal election. Australian political parties. Australia's parliament has long been dominated by the two major parties, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. And under Australia's Westminster system of government, it is only these two parties that win enough votes to get the 76 seats needed in the lower house to form majority government. On the political spectrum, the Liberal Party are on the right. They believe in a neoliberal style of capitalism. That is, that government should be small, taxes should be low, government regulation should be minimal, there should be free trade between countries, and that overall private corporations should be empowered to deliver the goods and services that society wants. Many Liberal Party voters are also socially conservative, so they want to preserve and enforce their preferred set of values, beliefs and social norms. Now, although the Liberal Party gets approximately 37% of the primary vote, in recent history they govern in coalition with the National Party, who are also on the right. The National Party are a bit more difficult to characterise because their members of parliament often vote against the interests of their voting base, but generally they have a strong rural voter base. Philosophically, they have a very anthropocentric worldview. That is, that land and natural resources should be used primarily for human benefit. So policies like government bailouts for farmers in times of drought, or support for forest clearing, as well as recreational activities like hunting and fishing. They also practice a very strong vein of identity politics and have a strong dislike for anyone they perceive to be a greenie. And they also have a lot of mistrust for people in the city having opinions on how land and natural resources should be managed. In the centre, we have the other major political party, the Labor Party, and they practice a strain of Blairite, Clinton-esque third way politics. That is, that they support free market capitalism, but that the wealth generated should be shared a bit more evenly. And they mix this with socially progressive rhetoric. The party is heavily aligned with the union movement. So they have a wing that has members from unions that are more associated with the heavier industries. That is construction, forestry and mining. And then they have the more socially progressive wing of the Labor Party as well. Generally, when it comes to campaigning, the Labor Party advocates for maintaining investment in health, investing in infrastructure such as roads, as well as more recently some renewable energy projects. They do some economic reforms here and there, and as well as that, they kind of philosophically believe that education is the big equaliser in society rather than taxation. And then on the left you have the Greens, who are pushing for the Scandinavian-style social democracy model. They have a strong history of campaigning to protect the environment. They're wanting a rapid transition to 100% renewable energy to do Australia's part to combat climate change. They want greater investment in restoring degraded ecosystems, and they're also strong supporters of LGBTQI rights. The Greens also believe that markets should be more strongly regulated and that corporations should pay tax and should pay for the externalities they produce, such as pollution. They're also pushing very strongly for democratic reform, which includes getting corporate money out of politics, as well as establishing a federal anti-corruption commission to provide better oversight of our federal politicians. The 2019 Australian federal election story. So every election has a particular story, and that story is often not known until after the election. But I think the story of this election will be the incompetence showed by the coalition over the last 6 years. And when I say coalition, of course, I'm talking about the Liberal Party and the National Party. And this incompetence in government will be enough to turn off voters from the centre and even in the centre-right. And I just don't think they'll be able to bring themselves to vote for the coalition, and they'll either vote for Labor, Independents or other minor parties. But in order to tell this story, we need to go back to the beginning. Prior to the coalition winning office in 2013, Australia was governed by the Labor Party in coalition with the Greens and 3 independents. In terms of number of pieces of legislation passed, this was one of the most productive governments in Australia's history, with many major projects and reforms implemented. Some of these projects and reforms included a price on carbon, the establishment of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA, the Gonski reforms to give more funding for schools, beginning the construction of the National Broadband Network based on fibre to the premises technology, as well as securing funding for the National Disability Insurance Scheme to give more support for disabled people so that they can live with dignity and have a greater participation in society. However, there were some problems with the government. The Labor Party was plagued by leadership struggles. Changes to border control policy meant that there were asylum seeker boats turning up on Australia's shores, and we've subsequently come to learn that the Australian public very much want strong border control. At the time, Tony Abbott was the leader of the Liberal Party, and he ran a very dishonest, negative but effective campaign saying that the Liberal Party, if elected to office, they would end the wasteful government spending. They would get rid of a price on carbon. They would axe the mining tax, and they would stop the asylum seeker boats coming to Australia. And the coalition was elected with a strong majority in the lower house in 2013. But since then, it's really just been policy failure after policy failure after policy failure. So let's start with climate change policy. In 2011 and 2012, Labor, the Greens and the Independents passed what was at the time world-leading climate change reforms. And this climate change reform included 4 key pillars. Number 1, a price on carbon. Number 2, the creation of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which was a government-owned bank that was using money generated from the price on carbon and using that to leverage private sector investment and using that investment to invest in Australian companies to reduce their emissions. Number 3, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which uses its funding to invest in early stage renewable energy projects and programs. And lastly, the creation of the Climate Change Authority, which was supposed to set emission reduction targets based on climate change science rather than political whims. The climate change reforms were highly successful. As we can see on this graph here, emissions for the electricity sector went down for the time that the carbon price was in place. Data released from Senate estimates was showing some very promising signs for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation.
Can you give me an update on what you calculate to be the dollar cost of emission reduction from the work that you are doing?
Well, Senator, as we're often generally lending and receiving a return above the government's cost of funds, then the emissions reductions that are being achieved at a negative cost. Our estimate at the moment is approximately $2 and negative $2.40 a tonne is the cost of the emissions that we're saving through our activities.
But can you tell us how many projects are in your pipeline and the value of those projects?
Well, there's approximately, I'm just looking at my notes, Senator, I'd say about 150 projects is what we indicated in March, and of course they're still, some will come in and some will go out. Those projects are seeking finance of about $4 billion, but they involve $11 billion worth of transactions. So as we co-finance transactions, we typically don't lend by ourselves. We try and attract a commercial partner, to another lender, to sit alongside us, because that's how we encourage the banks and other participants to come into the market. So we're expecting there to be about 11 billion of transactions, for potentially maybe seeking 4 billion from the CEFC.
As well as these successes, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency was and has continued to invest in many innovative projects in the clean energy sector. Some of these include research into different technologies of using renewable energy to create hydrogen gas, which will be a huge industry into the future. Under Tony Abbott, the coalition tried to abolish all of these initiatives, but was only successful in abolishing the carbon price. Now, it's important to point out that the campaign that Tony Abbott and other senior coalition figures ran to abolish the carbon price was based on many false claims. Two of the claims that Tony Abbott made was that after the abolishment of the carbon price, households would be $550 better off due to the reduction in power prices. He also said that because of the carbon price, the industrial town of Whyalla would be wiped off the map. Now, both of these claims were highly questionable at the time. Since the carbon price was abolished in 2014, we've actually seen power prices continue to rise all across Australia. And in some instances, wholesale power prices have actually doubled compared to what they were under the carbon price. And ironically, the industrial town of Whyalla is actually seeing a revival due to the construction of some large-scale renewable energy projects. So in 2014, the coalition abolishes the carbon price and replaces it with the Emissions Reduction Fund. And in all respects, this policy has been a failure. Philosophically, they took a system where the biggest companies in Australia and some of the most profitable had to pay the Australian government for the pollution that they produce. They changed this system to one where the Australian taxpayers are going to pay at least $2.55 billion to some of the biggest companies in Australia, not to stop them from polluting, but for them to pollute a little bit less. Although there has been scarce reporting on the Emissions Reduction Fund, we know that some of the projects the fund has invested in are completely flawed. One waste management site was paid for emissions reductions for installing technology to decrease their methane emissions. It has come to light that this company installed this technology more than 10 years ago and before the Emissions Reduction Fund even existed, meaning there was no additional emissions reduction produced from that investment. And in terms of overall goals, the Emissions Reduction Fund hasn't decreased Australia's emissions. They have continued to rise year on year since the carbon price was abolished. And then you get this bizarre situation where the coalition can't even accept their failure. Here is an interview with the Federal Energy Minister Angus Taylor trying to put some spin on the trajectory of Australia's emissions.
Emissions are up over the last 5 years, not down.
Well, actually, the latest greenhouse gas report that came out last week says that emissions are down by over 1% in the electricity sector, which is in my area.
They're up by 1% over a year.
No, you're wrong, Barry. And a report came out last week saying they are coming down. And
this is the Energy Department report.
No, this is the greenhouse gas inventory report.
Yes.
They are coming down, and the department rightly believes they're going to continue to go down. And the result of this is we will reach not just our Kyoto targets, and we're still in the Kyoto period, we will reach our Paris targets.
Are you talking about total emissions across the economy?
Total emissions are coming down
They're up by 0.9% over the year.
In the last quarter, they've come down 1.5%.
Not a quarter. Over the year, they're up by 0.9%, and they have increased every year for the last 5 years.
Well, they are coming down right now, Barry. And if we go right back, when we got into government...
That's not what the figures say.
Well,
The beginning of the end to Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership started when it came to implementing his promise to end wasteful government spending. So before the election, Tony Abbott was espousing this kind of voodoo economics. And what I mean by that is he was saying that he was going to deliver the same services but also cut government spending.
This is a government which is continuing to waste the taxpayers' precious dollars. What you'll get under us are tax cuts without new taxes.
The logic being that there's somehow bureaucrats that are just taking, bags of government money out to the outback and just burning it or something. And when Tony Abbott was pushed and asked, well, what services are you going to cut? Are you going to cut healthcare? Are you going to cut education? And he couldn't really answer this question. And it became a very sticky issue for him. So on the eve of the election, he went on national television and he made these commitments.
No cuts to education, no cuts to health, no change to pensions, no change to the GST, and no cuts to the ABC or SBS.
Then it came time for Tony Abbott to deliver his first budget in 2014, and he cut every public service that he promised not to cut. He cut healthcare, he cut education, he cut pensions, he cut the ABC and the SBS, he cut homelessness services, and he cut many other services as well. And the outrage in the Australian community about this level of deceitfulness shown by Tony Abbott and the Coalition was absolutely palpable. The leader of the Greens at the time, Christine Milne, gave this truly amazing speech, and she summed up many of the sentiments of the Australian community at the time.
But, Madam Acting Deputy President, the Abbott government's first budget is in a category of its own. The nation is reeling as people come to terms with the extent to which the Prime Minister has shafted and lied to people and led those who believed in him like lambs to the slaughter. It's breathtaking to watch the Prime Minister and his cigar-smoking Treasurer together with their hand-picked commissioners of audit, aided and abetted by the Murdoch press, try to con the community into believing that everyone has a moral obligation to share the burden of a confected crisis, arguing that the burden is being shared fairly, whilst making absolutely sure that the full weight is carried by those who have no power to fight back: the young, the sick, pensioners, students, and those least able to shoulder it, not to mention the natural environment and future generations. If you're privileged, the Liberals will protect that privilege. If you're already struggling, they will stamp you down and make your life harder.
Whilst the 2014 budget was probably the nail in the coffin for Tony Abbott, the longer he was Prime Minister, the more people became to realise he didn't really have a vision for the country. In a very prominent interview with a well-known journalist, Lee Sales, when he was asked about his economic vision for the country, this is what he responded with.
Let's quickly run through some other issues, Prime Minister, starting with the economy. When Labor left office, unemployment was 5.8%, it's now 6.3%. Growth was 2.5%, it's now 2%. The Australian dollar was 92 cents, it's now around 70 cents. The budget deficit was $30 billion when you took office, and now it's $48 billion. How do you explain to the Australian people that you were elected promising, in your words, to fix the budget emergency, yet in fact Australia's economic position has worsened under your leadership?
Well, I don't accept that. The boats have stopped.
We're talking about
Carbon
the economy.
taxes, the boats have stopped.
Fast forward to September of 2014, and with the coalition having lost 30 straight opinion polls showing that if there was an election to be called then, the Labor Party would be elected by the Australian community in preference to the Liberal Party, and then this happened.
Australia has a new Prime Minister after Tony Abbott was ousted by long-term rival Malcolm Turnbull. The ruling Liberal Party voted out the old leader in favour of the new, following months of infighting and crumbling voter support.
In the leadership was contested by Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott. Malcolm Turnbull was successful on 54, Tony Abbott 44, and we had one informal of 99. For the position of Deputy Leader, we had, to repeat that, 54 and 44.
The hastily arranged party leadership ballot also saw Foreign Minister Julie Bishop remain as Deputy Leader. Despite the announcement, a snap general election is not expected and Parliament will serve its full term. Mr Turnbull will be sworn in after Mr Abbott submits his resignation to Australia's Governor-General. He will be the country's 5th Prime Minister in 8 years.
Well, thank you very much.
Malcolm Turnbull was supposed to be the saviour of the coalition. He was seen as a more moderate Conservative, and he had substantial popularity with some sections of the Australian community. However, he turned out to be one of the least effective Prime Ministers Australia's ever had. Malcolm Turnbull's destruction of the National Broadband Network. One of Turnbull's biggest failures is the building of the National Broadband Network. In terms of the quality of our internet, Australia has long lagged behind many other developed countries, and our internet is particularly terrible in many rural and regional communities. And so, to address this problem, the National Broadband Network was conceived under the previous Labor, Greens and Independent government. And this network would be based primarily on connecting high-speed fibre optic cables from people's premises to the telecommunication centres. For short, this network was called the Fibre to the Premises Network. A national infrastructure project like this is always going to come at a significant cost, costed at about $50 billion at the time. However, this was a much needed upgrade, and considering the increasing digitisation of not just Australia's but the global economy, it was a worthy investment. And considering that Australia's GDP is worth about $1.3 trillion annually, it was an absolutely affordable project. When Malcolm Turnbull was Opposition Communications Minister, he ran a very strong campaign against the Fibre to the Premises National Broadband Network. He said it was too expensive, Australians don't need it in terms of what they use their internet for, and it will take too long to build.
Our commitment is to deliver very fast broadband to all Australians sooner, cheaper and more affordably.
Instead, Malcolm Turnbull promoted a mixed technology network based on internet delivered by wireless internet towers, satellites, fibre to the premises in some circumstances, but primarily a network based on fibre to the node technology. That is, a mix of fibre cables and old copper cables with nodes used as interconnectors. Malcolm Turnbull promised that his primarily fibre to the node based network would be delivered at a cost of $29.5 billion. The project would be completed by 2016 and that it would provide the internet that most people wanted. Fast forward to today, and Malcolm Turnbull's national broadband network has cost the Australian taxpayers more than $50 billion. It is 3 years behind schedule, and there has been a mountain of complaints from people who have had the NBN installed. But to completely grasp the scale of this calamity, we need to understand some of the history of telecommunications ownership in Australia. Telstra was once an Australian government-owned national telecommunications provider. That was until it was progressively privatised, mostly between 1996 and 2007, under a coalition government led by John Howard. A huge cost of this decision was that because the Australian government no longer owned Telstra's network, when it came to building the national broadband network, it had to buy back use of the internet ducts from Telstra in a deal that was worth $11 billion. Unfortunate though this was, the deal with Telstra was sealed. And after the fibre to the premises network was implemented, Australia would have a modern internet network, bought and paid for by the government, and this would provide a near universal public service, with more than 90% of Australians having fibre to the premises based internet, apart from a small fraction of people living in remote communities. When the coalition won government in 2013, Malcolm Turnbull implemented his primarily fibre to the node based network, and we, the Australian taxpayers, paid Telstra for its old, obsolete copper network. And to add insult to injury, we not only paid Telstra for its obsolete network, we then paid Telstra an additional $80 million to fix the network that we had just paid for. So to summarise one of the worst deliveries of an infrastructure project in Australia's history, Malcolm Turnbull delivered a national broadband network where the Australian taxpayers unnecessarily paid private corporations for a network that is obsolete. It is not universal. That is, some people get the superior fibre to the premises, while others get the inferior fibre to the node. And this project was delivered with huge cost blowouts and 3 years behind schedule. And to put the cherry on top, when it came to Malcolm Turnbull choosing whether he would have fibre to the premises or fibre to the node based internet, we now know that his department intervened to ensure that his home had fibre to the premises, whilst his two neighbours had fibre to the node. Because obviously what's good enough for the Australian community is not good enough for Malcolm Turnbull.
And when they went to the Queen to tell her her subjects had no bread, do you know what she said?
Let them eat cake.
Malcolm Turnbull's corporate tax cuts. Malcolm Turnbull's next big failure came from his proposal to cut the corporate tax rate in Australia from 30% to 25%, effectively giving big business a windfall of $63 billion. He came up with this idea in the vision that this $63 billion windfall would trickle down to Australian workers in the form of pay increases as well as additional employment.
So it's perfectly straightforward where we stand on this. If you lower company tax, you improve the return on investment. If you improve the return on investment, you get more investment. If you get more investment, you get more employment.
And what was so absurd about this policy is that due to legislation lobbied for by the Greens, we now know that dozens of corporations in Australia don't actually pay tax. As one example, data from the Australian Tax Office for the 2015-16 financial year showed that a company like Santos had an income of $3.4 billion, and yet they paid $0 in tax. So they're paying less tax than your average salesman or your average teacher or policeman. And we're going to give them, well, Malcolm Turnbull wanted to give them a tax cut on their $0 paid in tax. Whilst this is good economic policy in libertarian land, No matter how many times right-wing governments give corporate tax cuts, the data always shows a substantial portion of this money goes to shareholder dividends, share buybacks, and for paying for the massively inflated salaries of corporate executives. Analysis of this tax cut proposal undertaken by the Greens showed that an estimated $14 billion of this tax cut proposal was going to go to Australia's big banks, which have already been making billions of dollars of profits.
The big banks are an easy target. As household budgets stretch, their profits bulge, and there's a growing feeling on the backbench they don't deserve a tax cut, but the Prime Minister's trying anyway.
Company tax rate has got to really go across all corporations.
Additionally, a royal commission into Australia's big banks, once again pushed for by the Greens, have found these institutions to be systemically corrupt and have also been ripping off the Australian community for many, many years. Another reason this policy was a failure was it showed the complete hypocrisy of the coalition when it comes to debts and deficits. When the coalition was in opposition, they were constantly fear-mongering about debts and deficits, saying that the government is spending too much money, you can't afford public services, we need to reduce the deficit, and we need to pay off our debt.
This is a government which is continuing to waste the taxpayers' precious dollars. There is now a budget emergency.
They claim that they are going to have the biggest fiscal consolidation in modern history, and yet the budget deficit this year is blowing out by $15 billion.
And of course, we've seen the debt blow out and out and out. And today we have the revelation that the debt is not $107 billion, but well over $130 billion.
Then, when they're in government, they massively increase the debt, and for proposals like this, instead of using the money to close the deficit, they instead want to give tens of billions of dollars to big corporations. And perhaps most importantly, this policy was a complete failure because it showed just how out of touch the coalition was with the working class people of Australia. When I use the term working class, I don't mean it in the liberal sense, as in it's not how you look, it's not whether you like to have a drink at the RSL or whether you like to go and see operas. I mean in the broad sense, that is people who are forced to sell their labour for a wage, and that is most people in Australia. And when you look at wage growth for this class of people, wage growth over the last couple of decades, particularly in comparison to cost of living and inflation, wage growth is completely stagnant. Additionally, then when you compare wages to the proportion of corporate profits that have been generated over that same period, the distribution of wealth becomes even more egregious. And with all that context, when Malcolm Turnbull made his corporate tax cut proposal, many working class people were rightly wondering why on earth he wanted to give $63 billion to big corporations when many working class people in Australia are not seeing the profits and wealth generated in this country provide any substantial material benefit to their lives. The Coalition's internal war over climate change policy. The end came for Malcolm Turnbull when it came to climate change policy and what policy his government should introduce to continue to reduce Australia's emissions and ultimately decarbonise Australia's economy. Now, when it comes to the issue of climate change, there is a significant proportion of both the Liberal Party and the National Party that are in no uncertain terms climate change deniers. They either deny that climate change is happening, they deny the current and future impacts of climate change on Australia's environment and Australia's economy, or they deny the scale of transformation needed to decarbonise Australia's economy and ultimately the global economy as well. And it is because of this delusion that the Coalition engages in the climate change debate in an incredibly bad faith way. And to demonstrate this, I've put together a short montage.
I think that the climate change science is far from settled. The fact that we've had, if anything, cooling global temperatures over the last decade.
Before the election, the coalition warned household favourites like a roast dinner would become an expensive rarity under the carbon tax.
It'll be the end of our sheep industry. I don't think your working mothers are going to be very happy when they're paying over $100 for a roast.
Your understanding is we're going to exceed that 26% target already?
Well, my understanding is that we will meet it, yes. So we're doing what we need to do.
Right. More than meet it?
More than meet it.
And what's that based on?
Well, it's based on the figures that the data that is produced by those people who measure emissions.
That data shows.
But at the end of the day,
that data shows you're not quite going to meet it. You'll be 24%, not 26%.
Well, 24% is business as usual. Paris says 26%. My understanding is that we will meet that 26%, okay. And at the moment,
and
we're absolutely getting there. Yep.
Well, can you tell me by who?
Well, the fact is, at the end of the day, Labor wants 45%. So, we don't want to make
sure.
That
I'm just wondering where this suggestions come from that you'll actually exceed the 26% reduction.
Well, in the paperwork that I've read, in everything that I've, of course, we have briefings from the Environment Department, etc.
Is this from the department?
Well, my readings of the various government papers and the newspapers and media reports that I read and see.
The National Energy Guarantee, which will help lower families' power bills by $550 a year. But it also, following the closure of Hazelwood, which took 25% of the supply out of the market. Has gone from being an exporter of power at times to now being an importer of power.
And I've always wondered to myself why on earth politicians would go on national TV and constantly embarrass themselves with lies about climate change and energy policy. And then you look at some of the major political donors for the coalition and it starts to make sense. Over the years, the coalition have accepted at least tens of millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. And it is truly bizarre that we even allow this in our democracy. If you're a public servant and you accept money from a business in exchange for a government contract, then this is called a bribe. It is corruption, you'll be humiliated, you'll be sacked from the job, and you'll likely end up on the front page of the Herald Sun. However, if you're a politician and you accept money from the fossil fuel industry, and by pure chance you just happen to have policies that are very favourable to that industry, well, then this is called not a bribe, this is called a donation. So once again, with all of that context, it is the fusion of ideological climate change denial with a direct vested interest to prop up the fossil fuel industry, which has made the coalition absolutely pathological when it comes to the issue of climate change. To his credit, Malcolm Turnbull could see the increasing restlessness with the Australian community, and this is because the impacts of climate change are already being felt all across the country. So Malcolm Turnbull tried to implement 3 energy policy proposals, all of which would have been fairly modest in terms of the level of reductions in emissions. First, it was an emissions intensity scheme, which the Australian Electricity Market Commission found would have been actually cheaper for consumers than current government policy or a do-nothing approach. After that, it was a clean energy target, and then finally the National Energy Guarantee, or the NEG for short. Analysis from experts of the National Energy Guarantee found that this policy would likely not spur any new investment into renewable energy and thus lock in fossil fuels as a part of the energy mix for the life of this policy. For the climate change denying wing of the coalition, even the National Energy Guarantee was too ambitious. And after Malcolm Turnbull's policy was blocked by his own party room, with the coalition in a complete stalemate over climate change policy, then this happened.
I, Scott John Morrison, do swear.
Australia is introduced to another new Prime Minister, brought to power not in a popular vote, but rather installed by colleagues in a party ballot, facing a tough job.
To ensure that we not only bring our party back together, which has been bruised and battered this week.
Traditional grandson, here he is Jack.
Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister when he pushed out his predecessor Tony Abbott in 2015. Now Turnbull is the latest Australian leader to leave before the end of his term.
Australians will be just dumbstruck and so appalled by the conduct of the last week.
He blames a campaign of what he calls insurgents within his party and outside it, who wanted to see the moderate Prime Minister replaced with the more conservative Peter Dutton. As Minister for Immigration, Dutton was known for his hardline enforcement of the country's policy of sending asylum seekers to overseas prison camps. He first challenged Turnbull in a leadership contest on Tuesday and lost. He then demanded another vote on Friday, saying this time he had the support to win, and Turnbull didn't run as a candidate.
How the insurgents were not rewarded by electing Mr Dutton, for example, but instead my successor, who I wish the very best, of course, Scott Morrison, a very loyal and effective treasurer.
And boy oh boy did the knifing of Malcolm Turnbull leave a sour taste in the mouth of the Australian community. Now you would think that with Scott Morrison becoming Prime Minister in August of 2018, and with the election always likely going to be held in May of 2019, this 8-month period was always a short amount of time for a politician to make mistakes and to show your incompetency. However, Scott Morrison has done exactly that, and I've never seen a politician kick so many own goals in such a short amount of time. Scott Morrison's disastrous Prime Ministership. Scott Morrison's first own goal came from the Wentworth by-election, which was caused by the resignation of Malcolm Turnbull after he was ousted as Prime Minister. Scott Morrison was obviously worried about his government losing the 1-seat majority if they lost this by-election. The Wentworth electorate had a substantial proportion of Jewish Australian voters, and Scott Morrison thought a very cynical way of winning over these voters was to shift Australia's embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This was an incredibly rash decision, and we know it was rash because the Foreign Minister wasn't even aware of the decision until after the announcement. This cynical political manoeuvring by Scott Morrison completely backfired. The Liberals lost the Wentworth by-election. Many voters from the Jewish Australian community were rightly saying, "Do you think this is really the only issue we care about and that we can be bought so easily?" And then it came out later on that this decision was going to cost the Australian taxpayers $200 million. Not a very fiscally responsible thing to do from a party that claims to be fiscally conservative. Scott Morrison's next big failure came from his decision to allocate $3.9 billion to drought assistance funding to farmers and drought-affected communities, particularly in inland New South Wales. In the context of climate change, we know that droughts are going to become more frequent and severe in Australia, and it is likely that this is already playing out.
The second hottest summer on record, and now a dry autumn and winter have sucked all the moisture from these normally fruitful plains. 80% of the state is in drought.
I've recently been reading this very interesting book called Against the Grain. I'll just hold it up here. This book follows 14 farmers, and they've been doing a number of very innovative farming techniques to reduce their carbon emissions. Some of them are already carbon neutral. They use techniques to retain moisture in the landscape and to grow native vegetation for the wildlife benefits that this creates. And we absolutely need this type of innovation to be widely distributed across farming techniques all across Australia, but we also need to have a very serious conversation about the future of farming in Australia and how land and water should be managed as traditional farming areas become less and less productive as droughts become more frequent and severe due to climate change. However, in the short term, drought assistance funding is absolutely necessary. The problem for Scott Morrison came when it was revealed the $3.9 billion for drought assistance funding was supposed to be allocated to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is used to help disabled people have greater participation in society. And this robbing of Peter to pay Paul was met with significant backlash from parts of the Australian community. Another own goal for Scott Morrison came from the fallout from the Wentworth by-election. Because the coalition government no longer had a majority in the House of Representatives, they were increasingly worried about losing a vote on the floor of the Parliament. Because of this, they reduced the number of sitting days in the House of Representatives between November and the election to just 7 sitting days, effectively hamstringing their own government and giving themselves the smallest amount of opportunity to pass legislative reform. And, unsurprisingly, this did happen. When Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, he said that one of his priorities was to get electricity prices down.
Other than to say our government is going to put electricity prices down. We will put the big stick to ensure that the big energy companies do the right thing by you, the customers.
Due to Scott Morrison scheduling so few sitting days, the coalition had to abandon their big stick energy policy. And unfortunately for the Australian community, they've once again not seen any meaningful reduction in their power prices. In November, Scott Morrison announced that he was cutting $300,000 to a food bank charity, which provides food staples to Australians who have been impacted by natural disasters or economic hardship. And this was in the context of a federal budget that is worth more than $400 billion. So the coalition's disdain for people doing it tough was very much on show there. And then also in another very prominent interview Scott Morrison did, he said that he didn't want to be one of those conservative culture war type prime ministers. And then not long after that, in the context of discussions about Australia Day and Australians coming to grips with our history being based on colonisation and the brutal suppression of Indigenous Australians, and thinking about whether our National Day should be celebrated on the day that one of the initial colonisers, Captain James Cook, on the day that he first arrived to Australia. And in that context, Scott Morrison announced $50 million for commemorations for Captain Cook. And this was a kind of homage to British colonisation of Australia and a reassertion of European identity. And this announcement was a disaster for 3 reasons, really. Firstly, part of the funding is going to man a replica of Captain Cook's ship to circumnavigate Australia, which is completely ridiculous because Captain Cook never circumnavigated Australia.
I believe it will be a voyage of bringing Australians together.
Secondly, there are already more than 20 pieces of Captain Cook memorabilia dotted about Australia. There's the Captain Cook's cottage in Fitzroy Gardens in Melbourne. There's monuments at Botany Bay, there's statues at Cooktown. So there's already plenty of pieces of memorabilia honouring Captain Cook. So this really can't be seen as anything other than fighting a culture war. And thirdly, this announcement really did lay to bear the priorities of the coalition government. In the same year that they announced $50 million for Captain Cook memorabilia, they also cut funding to Aboriginal legal services, they cut funding to our national broadcaster, the ABC, and the $50 million was more money than was allocated to programs for domestic violence, sexual assault and elder abuse services combined. And this was rightly criticised on social media. And then there was the passing of the Medical Evacuation Bill, which essentially said that asylum seekers in offshore detention, some of which have already died from medical conditions that could have been easily treated with proper medical care, that these asylum seekers, they can be judged by a panel of medical experts and be evacuated to Australia for medical attention, and this can't be blocked by the immigration/border minister on medical grounds. And when this bill was passed, the coalition just went into nuclear meltdown.
On Bill Shorten's shoulders, the first boat that arrives.
And public broadcasts to would-be asylum seekers from the Prime Minister.
I'm here and I will stop you.
They said that Labor and the Greens, the Independents, had weakened Australia's borders, that now there would be, boats coming to Australia, even though the bill had provisions which said that it only applied to current people in offshore detention.
Your government MPs, people like Tony Abbott, saying that as a consequence of the bill that passed the House yesterday, it's now get on a boat, get to Nauru, get sick and get to Australia. When the law that passed the House yesterday...
that is entirely possible. That is entirely possible.
Finish. The law that passed the House yesterday clearly ring fences to the current cohort. So what Mr Abbott is saying is not true.
And to make a big spectacle out of this, the coalition announced that they were going to reopen Christmas Island, and Scott Morrison went there and he had a big press conference and said that, Labor's weakened Australia's borders.
The inside of Christmas Island Detention Centre has been off limits to the media. The government always argued that was on national security grounds, but now Scott Morrison is heading inside and he's taking cameras with him.
The view inside the razor wire seen for the first time as the Prime Minister led journalists on a tour of the Christmas Island Detention Centre, now back in business. And his message couldn't be clearer.
The last thing I ever wanted to do was reopen it. But here we are. Thank you, Bill Shorten.
This 3-hour visit by Scott Morrison is aimed squarely at Labor.
Anytime the people smugglers see me, they see a brick wall. Anytime they see Bill Shorten, they see an open door.
And now that we find out that the budget has came out, that we, as in the Australian taxpayers, effectively spent $185 million for a press conference because the Christmas Island facility hasn't been used for anything. So just a completely huge waste of money. This Christmas Island blunder marks a series of blunders from Scott Morrison, and we will likely see the end of his short Prime Ministership come the 18th of May. In summing up my thoughts, what can you really say about the coalition at this point? Over the last 6 years, they've shown themselves to be incompetent when it comes to delivering policy. They're pathological liars. They campaign on stable leadership, and they have now knifed 2 sitting Prime Ministers. They're on their way out, and they are now engaging in rampant cronyism and stacking high-profile government positions with Liberal Party members. Many of their ministers have been embroiled in corruption scandals, and it's hard to see at this point why their party exists other than to enrich themselves and to prop up the already privileged and powerful in society. Now, do I expect the Australian public to grasp all of these issues and all of the coalition's failures? No, I don't. Particularly considering the level of engagement of regular people with politics. But I do expect them to have received enough of the signal to be put off the coalition, and because of that, we're going to see a Labor government after the election. Thanks everybody for watching. If you liked my video, please subscribe, give me a like, or leave a comment. And I hope everyone has a lovely day. Thank you.